Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. When we come to places in life where there seems to be no way forward and no way back, then what do? Well, we obey God, even when we don't see a path forward. And today we're going to look at Exodus chapter 14 and the Red Sea crossing and see how the children of Israel obeyed God even in the face of the impossible. And that led them to witness an amazing miracle of the Lord. So welcome to the Key Chapters podcast. I'm Russ Brewer, and today we're studying one of the most well-known events in the entire Bible. And we're going to see what it looks like to obey God even in the midst of fear and confusion. So as we begin our study in this passage, let's start with the situation. We're coming to this scene that's filled with frenzied chaos and fear. The children of God are fleeing the Egyptian slavery that they've been enslaved in for 430 years. Now, they are following God, and He is with them, but from a purely human perspective, this is a dire situation. These are ex-slaves on the run being pursued by their former masters. They're being pursued by an enemy that is far more powerful than they are. These Egyptians have the latest in technology, the latest in resources in warfare. They are trained military going after these men and women and children who are fleeing. And these people are fleeing for their lives, and they come to this edge of the sea, and they get trapped between the mountains and the water. There's no way out. There's no hope. This seems like they may have been pursuing one of the greatest acts of folly they've ever seen. But in reality, there is nothing foolish about this at all, because they are going with the Lord and they are following His leading, and He's about to do a miraculous work in a way that's going to bring about the deliverance. And so as these people obey the Lord, they're going to see once again the Lord's power as He works to deliver His people. And so as we turn to Exodus 14, there are several key themes I just want to point out as we're looking at these verses. One theme is that of deliverance and provision. The Jews are now fleeing Egypt, and yet we're going to see that God is working to provide for them here, and we're going to see Him providing throughout this journey. Likewise, we're going to see in this passage the theme of sinful regret. Pharaoh regrets allowing the children of Israel to leave, and even the children of Israel regret leaving, but in all of this, God is still working. You also see in here the theme of man's doubts and God's faithfulness. Both Pharaoh and the children of Israel doubt God, and yet God has proven Himself to be faithful once again, and He's going to use this single event, this final event, to bring judgment upon the Egyptians and this deliverance to the children of Israel, and He'll ultimately bring glory to Himself. And so with these opening comments, now let's look at these verses, starting in verses 1 and 2. In verses 1 and 2, the Lord tells Moses to turn back and go to Pi-hahiroth. Now the name Pi-hahiroth might mean mouth of the canal, and there's an ancient canal in that region. The Lord also tells him to go near Migdol, which means tower or watchtower. And if you look on the map of the path of the Exodus, these locations are going to be southward of where they went at the end of Exodus 12. And so this is not a direct route to the Promised Land at all. This is going southward toward the Red Sea or the Reed Sea or the Gulf of Aqaba. We're not exactly sure where this crossing occurs. But either way, the Lord is telling them to go southward, and you'd think that the Lord would tell them to go northeast because that was in the direction of the Promised Land. By going southward, their journey is going to be extended, and therefore their arrival in the Promised Land is going to be delayed. But we know from Numbers 13 that the children of God were not ready to go to the Promised Land. In fact, this particular crowd of adults won't ever be ready to go to the Promised Land. They're too busy bickering and complaining and doubting God. And so this whole journey here, it's not really a diversion. It's intentionally a process whereby the Lord is going to purify His people and bring them to the place where the right people are the ones who go into the Promised Land. So the Lord's telling them to go to this place down by the Red Sea. But Pharaoh doesn't know this is from the Lord. He thinks they're lost. And so in verse 4, the Lord continues to harden Pharaoh's heart. And in verse 5, Pharaoh and his servants have a change of heart. They can't believe they've actually let the Israelites go. And so in verses 6 and 7, Pharaoh gets his chariot. He takes 600 select chariots with him, and they all chase after the Israelites. Now, these chariots would have been the most advanced technology of their day. These chariots gave these soldiers speed and armor and protection, and really the ability to dominate their enemy. But they were no match for the Lord. And in verse 8, the Lord again hardens Pharaoh's heart. And this is the last of the 18 times in the book of Exodus that mentions Pharaoh's hardened heart. And he's just committed and dead set to not letting these children of Israel go. And so in verse 9, Pharaoh overtakes the Jews by the edge of this sea here. Again, this could be the Gulf of Aqaba or the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds. Either way, in verses 11 and 12, the sons of Israel see Pharaoh's army coming upon them, and they're terrified. And they said in verse 11, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, that we might serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness." What a statement of despair. They have forgotten what God has been doing through the 10 plagues, and they're not understanding God's power or his desire to deliver them. They're just seeing this dead-end situation, and they can't see a way forward. But Moses gives them the solution. Trust and obey the Lord. And so in verse 13, Moses encourages the people and says, "Do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see them again forever." In other words, the Lord is going to fight for you. He's going to do this incredible miracle. Watch. And Moses tells the people in verse 14, "The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent." I love that. He will fight for you while you keep silent. Well, then in verse 15, the Lord tells Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel, go forward." Now, this isn't going to make a lot of sense. Going forward means going to the Red Sea. And yet, when God has given us a command, even if we don't see where it's going to take us, we must go forward. It's actually sinful not to. And so in verse 16, the Lord tells Moses, "Raise your staff," the same one that's been emblematic of all of God's plagues that God has used Moses to bring upon the Egyptians. And God is now going to do another miracle, and he'll be honored by what he's going to do. And then in verse 19, the angel of the Lord, who's been going before them, it says, moved and went behind them. And so the Lord has been going with the sons of Israel as this pillar of smoke and fire. He's been going before them. He's been leading them. But now he's going to go from leading them to protecting them. And so the angel of the Lord moves, and he stands between them and Pharaoh, and he's there all night, and Pharaoh and his army can't break through. And this fulfills Moses' words in verse 14, where he said the Lord would fight for them while they kept silent. And then in verse 21, Moses stretches his hands out over the sea, and the Lord brings a strong wind, and the waters divide. Now, you've probably seen depictions of this in movies or paintings. I'm sure none of them capture the awesomeness of this event as it's happening. And this is just a tremendous miracle. Verse 21 says that the winds blow all night and the sea was swept back. And the fact that the Lord uses these winds doesn't detract from this miraculous event at all. No wind would produce this wall. This is a miracle of God. And God is just using this wind as part of this miracle. And another thing to point out here is that this isn't a place where there was a shallow bit of water, because in verse 28, Pharaoh's army drowns in this water. So it's deep enough to drown an entire army. Going back to verse 22, so you've got this wind blowing, and the waters are divided, and the path forward is now dry land. And the children of Israel go through the Red Sea on this dry land with this wall of water on each side of them. Now Pharaoh sees this, and it seems like a safe route to follow them. And so in verse 23, it says the Egyptians followed the Jews into the Red Sea. But then in verse 24, the Lord works again. In verse 24, the Lord sees the Egyptian army on this dry ground in the midst of the sea, and the Lord brings confusion to this army. And in verse 25, the Lord caused the wheels to swerve and drive with difficulty. And even the Egyptians could see that this was of the Lord. They're trained fighting men. They know what they're doing. And they're like, the Lord is fighting for them. And they want to flee in verse 25, but it's too late. And in verse 26, the Lord tells Moses to stretch out his hands over the sea so that the waters might close in over the Egyptians. And Moses obeys, and in verse 27, the sea returns to its normal state, and the waters cover over the Egyptians, and the Egyptian army perished. Now, just as a side comment, this passage doesn't specifically say that Pharaoh was with his army when it was destroyed. And that may be an important detail because many conservative scholars would say that the Pharaoh here is Amenhotep II. And history says that Amenhotep II was not the firstborn son of his family, and so he didn't die in the 10th plague. But he did have a firstborn son who did die inexplicably. However, Egyptian history also says that Amenhotep goes and lives on for a long period of time, which would have been after this event. And so scholars point out that this passage doesn't actually say that Pharaoh died. And the other passages that refer to this event certainly allude to the widespread death here, but they don't specifically say that Pharaoh dies here. And so either way, clearly Pharaoh's army is destroyed here, but maybe Pharaoh himself is not. Anyway, when this is all done, look at the summary verse in verse 31. It says, "When Israel saw the great power with which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses." And so that's a quick overview of the Red Sea crossing. There's much that we can learn from this passage. For one thing, these are real events that really happened. And verse 31 makes this clear that this passage is given to us with the intent that we would know God and believe in him. Sometimes people think that these stories are basically fairy tales, but that doesn't make sense in light of verse 31. This passage here is a record intended for all mankind to know what God did in this event and believe in him. Now, this passage is also filled with spiritual realities that can help us understand how God works. For instance, with this Red Sea crossing, we see here that God may allow his people to face difficult events and still be in his will. Following the Lord does not mean that we will escape life's difficulties and challenges and pains. And here in this situation, they've come to this difficult event, But this difficult event's been designed by God to show them His holiness, His power, His glory. And they're seeing just who God is, and they're really, in a way, seeing how sinful they are, and they're just learning more about who God is. And so this difficult challenge here, it's been designed by God, and they're exactly where God wants them to be. We also see that sometimes doing the right thing might appear to be going in the wrong direction or making no real progress. I would imagine all of us have faced situations that have seemed like a dead end, maybe daunting or without hope. But often God will allow us into these situations to bring us to a place where we come to the end of ourselves and begin to trust in Him and walk with Him and obey Him. And that's often the place where we will see Him work. Likewise, we might come to situations where it seems more logical to retreat to a sinful domain that we know doesn't please the Lord, but it seems safer or easier or more comfortable, and we're just tempted to retreat to that place even though we know it doesn't please the Lord. God doesn't want this for us, and He will often bring us to this valley of decision where we are forced to step out in faith and trust Him and ultimately emerge far stronger and more obedient to Him. And finally, we shouldn't be looking for the parting of the Red Sea in our lives. We might be like, I'd have no problem obeying God if He would just part the sea for me from time to time, or maybe this lake over here, or that river over there. We need to realize that the point of this passage isn't trust God when He does miracles. Rather, it's trust the Lord with total faith and total obedience. Even if we can't see the way forward, He will make the way forward. God is calling us to simply obey His word and walk with Him and follow Him no matter where that journey takes us. And so that's Exodus 14 and the Red Sea crossing. As you go throughout your day, remember this. Remember that God does amazing work, but the people who see it are the ones who obey Him, even when they don't see the way forward. We'll end on that thought. Thanks for listening. Have a great day, and God bless.